WPF supports the concept of a control, but it doesn't mean quite the same thing as the control concept from earlier Microsoft user interface technologies such as Windows Forms and ActiveX. In those worlds, a control is a visible object, an object that provides an appearance which the user can interact with, and which also provides an API to the developer. Controls in WPF are similar, but not quite the same. Take the button control, for example. It offers a click event. That's an API feature, but is also related to user interaction. It supports the content model for composition, as we saw earlier, the ability to hold arbitrary pieces of content, and that's essentially an API feature. It can accept the focus, and that's mainly an interactivity feature. It can be associated with a command, another API feature, and it also supports the automation APIs, meaning that it's accessible to screen readers, automated testing tools, and anything else that uses the accessibility features of Windows. So that's kind of a combination of API and interactivity features. But there's one important thing the button control doesn't do in WPF, something that its Win32 or Windows Forms or ActiveX counterparts have that it does not. The button control in WPF has no appearance. It does not know how to render itself. And this is the main thing that makes controls in WPF different. They're what we call lookless, which is a horrible word. A lookless control has no intrinsic look. It's not a good word, but it is the official description. The appearance of a control in WPF is provided by a completely distinct entity, the template. And you can see here why the template is separate. Any single control type might need different visuals in different contexts. So here we can see the button as it appears in Windows Vista's Aero theme, and also a couple of variants from Windows XP's Luna style. And on the right, we can see the classic Windows 2000 look. And beneath that, you can see the style used on the Media Center, the Royale theme as it's known. And then beneath that, you can see why you should never hire a developer to do your user interface design. That's a button as drawn by me. So we really don't want the visuals of the button to be baked in. The button shouldn't have a fixed idea about how it looks, because different themes require different visuals. And we may also want to define a custom look for our button that is particular to our application. So this is why WPF separates the control into two parts: the look, defined by the template, and everything else, defined by the control itself. Let's take a look at how this works in practice. Here's a simple button control. Right now, it's using the default theme for the Windows Vista Aero look, but we can replace this look with our own template. The template is just a property of the control. However, we can't just set it with an attribute in the XAML, because templates are relatively complex constructs, so we need a slightly more expressive syntax. And XAML offers a more verbose but more flexible way for setting properties, sometimes referred to as the property element syntax. So if I create an element with a dot in the name, like this, XAML will interpret the bit before the dot as a class name, and then the part after the dot as a property name. So I'm telling XAML I'd like to set the button's template property here. So it won't interpret this as being normal content of the button. It will understand that what goes inside of here is actually a value for the property. And now I can put any object I like in here as the XAML. Or at least that's what the XAML syntax means. This particular property needs to be of a particular type, which is control template. Now, control templates need to be told what their target type is. So this needs to know that it's the template for a button. This may seem slightly odd because you might think it could work it out from the context. However, normally control templates are defined externally to the controls themselves. They usually live in different places. So here I happen to be doing it in line, but that's mainly for the convenience of the demo. Most of the time control templates are completely separate from their controls, so they need to be told what kind of a control they are for, otherwise they don't necessarily work properly. So let me just close off this tag. And there you have it. That's the natural look for a button, which is to say it has no natural look at all. So I've turned off the Windows Vista Aero look, and I've said, here's mine, but there's nothing in here yet. So now I can start filling in the appearance. Let's use a rectangle, and I can just hard code in the color. So I can say I'd like a blue rectangle as the visuals, and maybe I'd like to set the corner radiuses like so, to be rounded. So I've got nice rounded corners on my rectangle there. Let's zoom in a bit so you can see a bit more clearly. So we're starting to make some progress, but this hard-coded background colour isn't really such a great idea. What I really want is for the background of my button to reflect whatever background colour has been chosen up here when the user created the control, because there is a standard property called background. If I set this, you can see nothing is happening. So this hard coding of colours isn't really quite the right way to go. Instead, what we want to do is to tell WPF that this property here, this fill property of the rectangle, is going to reflect the value of the button's background. And we do this using a special syntax. It looks like this. I say template binding, followed by the name of the property. And now the fill of the rectangle is reflecting the chosen background color of the property up here. Whatever I type in, it will appear. And if I get rid of this completely, it will revert to the standard background of the Vista Aero button, which notice has this slightly shiny look. That's actually achieved using a multi-stop gradient fill, so it has a sort of slight look of a reflection about it. Let's put back a slightly simpler, one green, that'll do. So, I've got the background of my button here, and I've connected up that through this fill property. Now these curly brackets, these signify that this is not a normal property value. This tells XAML that I'm using something called a markup extension. Markup extensions are objects that decide at runtime how the property is going to be set. So what this syntax actually means is it says I'd like to create an instance of the template binding class. So I'm creating another object. I'm passing this string background as a constructor parameter. And then WPF will expect this whole thing to derive from a certain base class. It will expect it to derive from markup extension. And that base class defines an abstract method called provideValue. And WPF will call that to let this object decide at runtime how it's going to set that particular property. And there's several examples of this. We'll see many more as the week goes on, and you can write your own as well. If you want to decide at runtime how a particular property is going to be set, you can build a custom markup extension if you like. They're just objects at the end of the day that are used in a particular way by XAML. So, that's how I wire up properties of the control into the template. So I could, in theory, do a similar sort of thing to get the caption to appear. So I could try this. Text block text equals template binding content to bind the content property of this text block to the control. And the first problem we'll hit, says down at the bottom there, if you look at the error text, control template already has a child and cannot add text block. This is exactly the same problem we ran into when trying to put content inside of the button. So what we need to do is solve it the same way. I need to wrap this in some sort of layout element. I'm going to use a grid this time. The reason I'm choosing a grid is because it happens to make it easy to put multiple elements in the same space. I want these things to overlap, and grids are a convenient way of doing this. So now I've got the text block on top of the rectangle, which I'll choose a slightly paler background color to make that a bit easier to see. Let's go back to yellow. So my text is there. Obviously I've got a slight problem with an underscore appearing, but actually I've got a more major problem than that. Remember, I was able to put anything as the custom content inside my button in the earlier demo. If I try that again now, it's not going to work so well. If I try and put an ellipse in here, so I'm now working inside the button itself rather than inside the template. I'm going to create a red ellipse as the content of the button. Let's give that a width of 80, 60 or 50, whatever, something that fits in my button, and a height of 14. And nothing happens. And what's happened here is I've asked for a text block. A text block is a primitive element that only knows how to display text. So when I try and bind it to an ellipse, it just goes, well, I don't know what to do with that. That's not something I know how to render. And in fact, I've used completely the wrong kind of element here. What I should have done is used a special purpose element called content presenter, and I should have bound its content property to my controls content. Content presenter says, here is where I would like this content to be injected. And Content Presenter actually does all of the work of the content model. Any place you see content plugged into a control, whether it's a button or a list box or a tab control, whatever it might be, it's always the Content Presenter doing the work. So this is the thing that does the magic to make it happen. So now I can have any mixture of content I like. I could have a stack pattern here, or I could put back the original text. If I put in _click me, one of the things the Content Presenter will do for me is it can handle the access key. If I say recognizes access key equals true, the underscore vanishes until I hold down the Alt key. So it's now doing that keyboard acceleration for me. By the way, by convention, we usually hang some other things off the Content Presenter as well. There are some alignment properties. If I set the Content Presenter's horizontal alignment, I can bind that to the horizontal content alignment property of the button. And notice now that the content appears centered, because by default, the button control's horizontal content alignment is set to centered, and that says where I'd like the stuff inside the button to appear. And I can do a similar thing with the vertical alignment. If I say this Content Presenter should be vertically aligned according to the value of the vertical content alignment property of the control, then that also centers itself within the button. And in general, this is how we do things. We wire up properties of the control to properties of things inside the template. Because the control itself doesn't know what to do with these properties. The control itself is not responsible for its own visuals. It does not know what the background property is for, even. It expects the template to take care of all of these things. So it's the job of the template to project all the properties of the control onto the screen. And that's how we customize controls in WPF.